Good evening, I'm Laurie Johnson. Welcome to Houston Public Media's new web series, Political Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by show hosts and commentators Aiyer and Brandon Rottinghaus to discuss all things political. Tonight we'll continue the conversation from Red, White, and Blue about what Houstonians will be seeing on the ballot this November. So let's get started, Jay and Brandon. What are the big items that Houstonians are paying attention to that we'll be voting on?
I think top shelf is going to be the mayor's race. Yeah. It's going to be the one thing that's going to drive a lot of people to the polls. Well, I say a lot of people, and what I mean by that is about 15% of the people. But that's going to be the one issue I think people are going to be most concerned about. We've had, I think, a lot of contenders here who are really engaged and who are quite well suited for the position, and the voters are going to have to make some tough choices.
Yeah, I mean, we thought, I think initially when this started, that we'd see a lot of energy, a lot of turnout, and it would go up and, you know, sort of go away from that trend of having a smaller turnout elections. You know, I think there were estimates at some point of 20 to 25% of the total of registered voting. But to Brandon's point, it's really, I think, we've all been surprised and I think shocked that it's really not come together the way people had thought, and it's looking much more like a traditional kind of low turnout election, like something, the type of election we've had really the last few cycles.
Yeah. Isn't that largely, though, because the candidates are running to get into a runoff?
Yeah, they're kind of holding their fire for the case of, you know, making sure you've got a little bit of hay left in the barn for the next round. There's no doubt that some of that's true, but I think part of it is just the case that the economy's pretty good in Houston, right? And no one's really activated about any particular kind of one major issue. People have issues with potholes and there's traffic problems, but this is a major city and people have these kinds of concerns. And so these are the kind of things I think that are a problem only in a kind of very sort of narrow segment. And so this is something that's going to be, you know, what the candidates talk about, and that's not terribly exciting. That doesn't lend itself to a kind of real interactive, sort of dramatic kind of campaign. So we've had a pretty boring run of it.
Right. I mean, when you look at the right track, wrong track arguments in terms of the city, you look at it and say, okay, generally speaking, people are happy with the direction of the city of Houston, whether or not they think that the city is being well run or they recognize we have problems. They feel like things are generally pretty good. And when you have that dynamic, you tend to not have large scale interest in sort of a change in leadership. So you combine that with the fact of a lot of candidates that really are sort of focused on different constituency groups and are focusing on that. It doesn't lend to kind of a large scale attempt to try to generate a lot of new voters into the process.
Yeah, it's going to be trying to get like a very small segment of voters to get out, and that's a pretty, you know, that's a pretty narrow enterprise. It doesn't lend itself to this kind of internal dynamic where you're going to see a lot of drama between the candidates, and that's what really propels a kind of, you know, narrative about the race. I mean, I think part of the problem here is that, you know, it's the candidates haven't really gone after each other much. We've seen a little interactions between them on some key issues, but the candidates have been largely kind of running on their biography, and that biography, you know, for each tends to be slightly different. And so it's the puzzle the voters are going to have to kind of piece together. But as it is now, we haven't seen a lot of real friction between them.
Well, also, I can't really tell a whole lot of difference between their policy positions. They all sound like the same, and whichever one I vote for, they'll probably end up with the same results, right?
Right. I mean, you're looking at sort of a continuum of kind of center right to center left, and really, but they're all really straddling the center. So your most conservative candidate is not even really a card-carrying member of the, you know, sort of conservative. You know, he's famously unapologetically moderate, I think is the title of his book. And the most progressive candidate, arguably in the race, was a moderate Congress member. And so it's like you're looking at it from a continuum where the progressive and the conservative really aren't as far apart as I think some people think they are. And so everyone's sort of shuffled in the middle. But the interesting thing is everyone's got a different set of constituents they're trying to get out. And this has turned into a turnout race just on that. And there's no real incentive to have a large scale number of people vote. You just want to get your people voting. You want your 40,000 people to vote so you can get into a runoff, and you know, the rest you don't care about.
And Jay's right. I mean, I think that there's worry amongst the campaigns that if you bring more voters out, that you don't know what those voters will do, right? It's like asking a question in court that you don't know the answer to. You want to make sure you know what the answer will be once you get that voter in the voting booth. And for campaigns to try to broaden the base of their appeal doesn't make a lot of sense for them strategically. So they're really focusing on sort of their voters, their issue, and that's going to be good enough for them.
Early voting is just around the corner. What else is on the ballot? I mean, all I've heard about so far is the mayor's race and the equal rights ordinance. What else are we going to be voting on?
Well, we're voting on several council races, a controller's race. We're really turning over city government in a pretty dramatic way. And so those campaigns are really at the mercy because they're drowned out by a pretty dull mayor's race and as you mentioned, the HERO referendum. And that's been the big driver. So part of it's going to be how that kind of fits into this as well. And so we're going to be electing a whole new city government. We've got, you mentioned the HERO ordinance is on there, but there's also a term limits ordinance, right? Yeah. Which is going to change the length of terms potentially from 2 to 4 years.
This is something that has always failed in the past.
Yeah. This has traditionally been sort of voter reluctance to engage, and so statewide, of course, we've seen this too. Anytime you change the Constitution in terms of structural issues, the voters tend to either ignore it or tend to turn against it. So I think that these things typically do fail. But I mean, Jay's exactly right. You've got here a kind of real turnover in city government, and you're going to have a lot of competitive races that are going to be largely determined by what happens at the top. So if HERO does in fact bring out a significant degree of conservatives or liberals, you've got county-wide efforts at play here in terms of the bond election. You've got citywide candidates who are running in the at-large number 1, at-large number 2, at-large 4 probably that are in play that could go either way in turnout. So that this is going to be, I think, a lot of this will be driven by what's happening at the top, but the implications are profound.
And you've also got an interesting phenomenon of slates that has developed. So you've got the conservative Republicans of Texas, I think that's an acronym, that Dr. Hotze's group that we talked about before has been sort of the leading proponent to defeat the HERO ordinance. He's got a slate of candidates out there, and some of them came in at the end, and they're running them in almost every district and almost every seat, and that's an attempt to sort of drive out. So if you see this wave potentially in HERO, what you could see is a real changing, driving some candidates into runoffs, making some unexpected outcomes, and when it comes to some of the council races. So we could see real changes in government. And that's what happens when only 175,000 people vote out of a city of 2 million and 1 million plus voters. Yeah.
What about the city controller's race? This is a fairly powerful position that almost nobody knows about. And we have a lot of candidates, a very wide field. I'm really interested in Carroll Robinson just because one of his campaign issues is legalizing gambling, casino gambling in the city. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Jay is a real expert on the comptroller's race. He's been very interested in those things, so I'll defer to him on some of that. But it's a very wide open race. So, but there's a lot of interest, I think, because it could be a position that has some power if the particular candidate would make it be as such. Typically, in a strong mayor system like this, they're not going to have a lot of influence, but there's potential for it, and so maybe the right candidate could make that work.
Right. I mean, I think there's two issues here. One is that we recognize that there's an issue with pensions. We recognize there's some financial issues. And I think that for the last few years, there's a feeling that the controller's office has been a little more quiet than it has in the past. I think there's an opportunity for a new controller to come in. You mentioned Carroll Robinson's. He is getting a lot of attention because on the issue of sort of legalized casino gambling, which seems sort of extraneous to what the basic functions of it is. But the mere fact that you understood it or asked about it means that whatever he's doing is working. Now, in full disclosure, Carroll is my colleague at Texas Southern University, and I've known him for a long time. But it's interesting that he's latching onto it because it's for that precise purpose. It's hard to drive interest in a race that's basically electing a person whose primary job is to sort of write checks and be the bean counter for the city. I mean, there's a performance audit function, but we don't really talk about it. It's really talking about paying the bills, right? So when you're having something like, tax revenues through casino gambling, all of a sudden I was like, what? I like that. That sounds interesting, or I hate that.
Well, and the thought comes to mind, you're campaigning on this platform. Is it even possible?
Yeah, it's a great legal question because I actually think, I've had the conversation with him because I had the same reaction you did, and there are some odd legal, I shouldn't say odd, there's some legal theories that might allow it to happen. It's certainly debatable.
Try to put that on a bumper sticker.
Yes, yes, it's certainly debatable. But again, it goes back to what I said. I think the point is to have the conversation, and The fact that the only controllers candidate anybody really talks about is the one that's talking about this sort of speaks volumes about that race. It's like most people don't know any of the council candidates running. Most people don't know any of these guys. Or gals.
But it has been, and you've talked about this before, it's been a springboard to other kinds of races. So in fact, the person who wins that seat could have a leg up in the future in other kinds of, other kinds of candidacy. So there's real value in voters paying attention to these kinds of things. But as you said, it's hard to get them to pay attention because it's a pretty low profile kind of a job, and so this is something that they really need to sort of find a way to talk to voters that, who are going to make sense of all this thing.
So we didn't talk about this in red, white, and blue, but what happens to Mayor Parker after this? Where does she go from here?
Well, that's a great question because there's been a lot of speculation about her. She's out there on the hustings now, campaigning for Secretary Clinton. There's been speculation that if Secretary Clinton becomes President Clinton, that you could see Mayor Parker in the cabinet at some position. The county judge race in 2018. The person who was sort of the presumptive Democratic nominee is now running for mayor in Adrian Garcia. And so that seat will be open. I think Judge Emmett has declared he's not going to run. So that's another possibility for her. I don't think statewide is realistic for her, largely because it's not seemingly realistic for any Democrat these days.
Right.
But I think she definitely has a future, and she sees herself having a future. She's quite young and has been, I think, largely popular, remains popular in Houston, and I'm sure wants to continue on in public life.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of Democrats who are considering and thinking about statewide offices, but are reluctant to do so given the wave of red the last couple of cycles. That makes complete sense. But I think that the Democrats need to keep these folks in line. They need to make sure that they're part of the system, to make sure that they're still active, that they're keeping their contacts going, because when it comes to the point where some of the races become competitive, they're going to need a deep bench, and they're going to have people like Mayor Parker who have done, a good job in Houston and who are noticeable in these big cities to be able to get some turnout and push people to the polls. So they need her as much as she needs them.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate it. And thank you for watching this evening. Remember to log on to HoustonPublicMedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week. Good night.